I'm not sure that song was familiar to all of us. It was familiar to me, but sometimes those are the hardest ones to sing. This morning, I have somewhat struggled this morning to come this morning and share a word of hope and peace, one that I can dedicate to children here in Bridgeport, here in our congregation, and around the world. We light this light for Luis Colon, for sure, in his memory, but also we light this light in memory and in honor of children all across our country and all across the globe who struggle this day, who live in fear of war, whether it's armed conflict in war zones, whether it's refugees fleeing the Mediterranean, going to Sweden or Europe, whether it's children coming up from Central America or South America, fleeing the violence of their countries, trying to cross our borders. So in the midst of all this, we are called by our faith to celebrate Christmas. We are called to say Merry Christmas, yet another Sunday in the liturgical calendar. We're called to be lights and beacons of peace and joy. And we're called to do so every day of the year. So let me share with you a beautiful poem called The Mood of Christmas by Howard Thurman. It's a poem that Reverend Sarah and I talked about this week, and I think it sets the tone for us of why we celebrate Christmas yet again this Sunday and again next Sunday until the Sunday of Epiphany. The words of Howard Thurman. When the songs of the angels is stilled, when the star in the sky is gone, when the kings and princes are home, when the shepherds are back with their flock, the work of Christmas begins. To find the lost, to heal the broken, to feed the hungry, to release the prisoner, to rebuild the nations, to bring peace among people, to make music in the heart. So in many ways, if we hold Scripture in one hand and this poem by Howard Thurman in the other hand, Christmas is just beginning. Christmas wasn't really celebrated when we opened our gifts and hung out with our families, which was joyous and beautiful. I love that part of the Christmas celebrations. That was just the invitation to celebrate Christmas throughout the year. So, how do we here in our church celebrate Christmas this Sunday? We're called to consider this question, the good news. Who is Jesus, born in a lowly stable? Who is Jesus, the good news of God to us this year, in this liturgical calendar year? My guess is we all have different answers to this. Some of us might call Jesus friend. Some might call Jesus Savior, Son of God, beloved, companion, defender, perhaps of the poor. All of us have our own relationships with Jesus that call us into relationships with each other, our families, our friends, our neighbors, and even strangers we meet along the way. When I'm asked, who is Jesus, the good news of God, I answer, Jesus is unequivocally the Prince of Peace. For me, Jesus is the Prince of Peace. Yet even that answer is nuanced. When I think of Prince of Peace, I don't think of a lofty title of a man far removed from the people, a man of wealth or prestige, or a man of political ambition, ready to take big office far removed from the people that he or she may serve. When I think of the Prince of Peace, I think of liberator of the oppressed, the prophet of peace, radical love. Teacher of nonviolence. The list goes on and on. All of that kind of encapsulated in the idea of Prince of Peace. To better describe my understanding of the Prince of Peace, I would like to share with you bits and pieces of the Pace Bene Christmas letter called Christmas Celebrates Nonviolence by Father John Deere. Now, you have to know a little bit about John Lennon and the Beatles, but we'll just have to go along with that if we don't. And so, this is Christmas, and what have you done? That's the question which John Lennon puts to us in his famous Christmas song. In the chorus, he gets right to the point, to the heart of Christmas. War is over if you want it. And so this is Christmas. What have you done? For some, that might seem like a leap of faith, but I think John Lennon's theology was pretty good, better than most. If you want to celebrate Christmas, he says, work for the end of war and the culture of war. Spend your life pursuing a new culture of peace for everyone. For everyone. Christmas celebrates the birth of the most active person of nonviolence in the history of the world, as Gandhi once described Jesus. In the gospel account of Jesus' birth to homeless refugees, angels announced to poor shepherds the coming of peace on earth. He grew up to become a great peacemaker, a nonviolent activist who denounced war and systematic injustice and offered the gift of peace to everyone, near and far. The life of Jesus is a record of pure, radical nonviolence, like Mahatma Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr., or others we know of here in Bridgeport and around the world. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus taught the methodology and vision of nonviolence. Offer no violent resistance to the one who does evil. Love your enemy. Hunger and thirst for justice. Blessed are the peacemakers. Jesus formed a community of nonviolent resistors and organized a grassroots movement of nonviolence to disarm everyone. He led his campaign of nonviolence from the countryside of Bethlehem and Galilee to Jerusalem, where he engaged in dramatic, nonviolent civil disobedience and was immediately arrested and killed in Jerusalem. But he lived on in the community and the movement, and that creative faith-based nonviolence continues today. I would like to think that I have been given the opportunity to be a part of that movement of nonviolence and peacemaking in my ministry as a Christian pastor in the United Church of Christ. Whether it's here in the United States or far away in places like Hebron or Bethlehem or Jerusalem, or in places in Africa or in South America or in the streets of Chicago. And who knows what this may bring to me now that I'm here in Bridgeport. Who knows what I'll be called to be a part of as your pastor in your community and in our city. Father John continues, to be a Christian is to renounce every trace of violence and carry on Jesus' grassroots movement of gospel nonviolence. It is to see life through the eyes of peace and a nonviolent struggle for peace on earth. It means renouncing our own violence and our own complicity in the culture of violence. We get rid of our guns, stop supporting the military, turn off our television, serve the poor, welcome the refugee, advocate for justice, and work for disarmament. It means upholding a whole new vision of shared community, a whole new world of nonviolence. Now, this is Father Deer's letter of Christmas. These are his convictions about what it means to be a Christian in a world of conflict and war. What we're called to think about is, what is our conviction? How do we follow, with our own gifts and our own skills, the path of the Prince of Peace? How are we called into relationships? Perhaps we have to first start in our own heart of hearts and cleanse ourselves of the violence within. How we relate to our family, how we relate to our neighbors, how we think or respond to news on the television when a child of 14 is killed on our streets. Perhaps the violence we have is how we respond to say, oh, it's just another child, or just another person from the South Side. Or maybe it's just another gun victim. Well, there's gun victims every day in the United States. How do we transform ourselves to see that child as a child of God, a beloved child, a child with a future, a child with a family? How do we see and interact with refugees that are so far away? We'll never meet most of them. We'll never be called maybe to hold a refugee child in our arms or to welcome a family. But how do we think of that situation? Do we first see a child of God in those faces fleeing war and turmoil? So this nonviolent revolution, if you may call it that we're called to this Christmas by Father Deer, begins right here in our hearts. I know I have work to do. I imagine we all have work to do for this time of transformation. And when I think of Father John's letter, I think of peacemakers who I've met throughout my life. Now, certainly there are adult peacemakers, right? There's Oscar Romero, who was the Archbishop in El Salvador, who was assassinated right in the middle of worship, killed by soldiers trained at something called the School of the Americas, which is a school at a military base at Fort Benning, Georgia. The same soldiers, or the same training was given to soldiers who killed and raped nuns in El Salvador, which is when it's a hard story to hear, I know, when we hear these sad stories. Those are peacemakers. These nuns are peacemakers. Archbishop Romero are peacemakers. But the peacemakers that have transformed my life are the peacemakers we hardly ever hear of. Or all the El Salvadoranians in that war who chose peace over violence. For me, these stories of peacemaking come from the places I've served. And the stories I'd like to share with you today are stories of children. I have a few pictures, probably too many, but this is what I want us to consider today. When I served in Chiapas, Mexico, which is the most southern part of Mexico, if you think of Mexico as wide at the top, and then Mexico kind of gets really narrow, then it pops up to the Yucatan Peninsula. At the most lower edge is Chiapas, and then next to that is Guatemala. Well, I got to serve there in a variety of capacities with our church, and one of the most amazing stories is a story of this young girl that you see in this picture. I'll pass it around, but let me just hold it out. It's probably too small. As you can see, she's an indigenous. She's a Mayan girl. She's about 11 years old. And if you see what she's doing, if you want to move up, I don't know if you can see that far away. We can pass them around. If you see what she's doing, she has her hands up against the military, the Mexican military. Well, in 1998, it was just after a massacre in the refugee camp or village of Acteal, where over 40 men, women, and children were killed by their neighbors, who also said they were Christians. The guns blessed at church before the massacre. This girl and the women of her community were amazing. Here you go, and we can pass that around. What they did is the military wanted to set up a base in Shoyep, which is basically a refugee camp. Here's a picture of kids in school, all crowded around a desk. You can just pass these around. It's going to be a little hard, but, just maybe you have to get up and help a little bit. There you go, Marge. So this is a refugee camp. The military had to come 3 times. They came the first time with helicopters. Well, first they came in the land. Troops came in, and the women said no. Then they tried again, and the women came out and surrounded the village and said no. The third time they came, I guess they came in helicopters, and they got out and they came. They wanted to set up a base, and the women of that town, including the children, this 11-year-old girl, stood against those soldiers, put their hands up and said, "Not in our community. We will not let you bear arms in our community. We will not let you give us the false protection of military power. We are nonviolent Christian Mayan people who have been displaced from our land because of terror and fear, because of economics, and we will not let you kill us and control us." The story goes, of course it's a legend, that if the men would have done that same act, if the men here, young as Nick over there, if the men here would have done that same act, gone out to confront the military, they would have been gunned down and killed. But because it was women and girls saying no and using their bodies as a way to say no, the military didn't know what to do. They weren't sure what to do with girls and women standing up against them nonviolently. Perhaps they saw their mothers. Perhaps they saw their sisters or their daughters. The Mexican military did not set a base up in Shoyep refugee camp. They had to do it a few hills over. To me, that is a story of nonviolence that gives me strength and gives me joy, and that is a celebration of the Prince of Peace, and is a story of that nonviolent grassroots campaign that Jesus started in the Galilee. And here are some pictures of little girls from that same community. We'll just pass these around. Some of you might get to see them, some of you won't, but we'll get them around. Here you go. You have to be the passer of the photos. Now these, the next few pictures are from work I did in Africa, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and in Uganda. We just have pictures of little children. I just want to bring some of these pictures home. This is my partner in the Christian Peacemaker team who went with me, Sandra. She was playing games with the children. These children live in a refugee camp in Uganda. And we were visiting there to study a little bit about the struggle of women in that country and the active peacemaking they're doing. Now, peacemaking in the Congo during this visit was very difficult because the violence was so strong. And people were getting killed. Hundreds and hundreds of people were getting killed. Even, in that war alone, 5 million people died, whether it was from war or from famine. But these women, in every village we stopped at, we were in a women-to-women delegate, every village we stopped at, women had women's groups that were taking care of other women who had suffered violence by the military or by the rebels. So women who had already been injured by the violence of war, because in that place, and in many places, war was carried out on the bodies of women. So women were dehumanized and destroyed and attacked, sexually violated. But those women were able to keep their strength and care for the next women who suffered these kind of war crimes. They were able to find the strength to go on. The youngest was a child that was hurt in that war when we were there. She was about 2 years old. The eldest woman who was injured was in her 80s. But those women are people who keep the peace in their country going. It's those women who tell the story of peace to me this Christmas, who witness to me what the peace, the Prince of Peace, is all about. And these last two pictures we can share around are children from Bethlehem and the city of Hebron. Now, these children are dear to my heart because I taught in Bethlehem, or I taught in Jerusalem in years ago, and I've been back to Bethlehem and the West Bank several times over the years. But these kids were peace activists, and you want to know why they were peace activists? Not because they marched in the streets or because they made beautiful signs and had protests and shut down, the Magic Mile or whatever that's called in Chicago on Christmas and didn't let people shop. These kids were peacemakers because they went to school every day. Now, when I was a kid, there were times I would have done just about anything not to go to school. Maybe a test I didn't study for or one of those projects I never did. I was not the best student in my early years. It took me a little bit of while to develop that finesse. So, I would try to skip out of school. But these young kids that they taught me in Hebron, elementary school kids, I remember distinctly being in that cold cement classroom in Hebron. There's no inside heat, right? There's no heat. You just don't have heat in your houses. You have these little kerosene heaters. So we're talking there, and they wanted to know us. Our job as Christian peacemakers in Hebron was to walk kids to school in the morning, Palestinian kids, to keep them safe from Israeli military violence and Israeli settler violence. It just was the reality of life in Hebron, okay? So we would walk these kids to school, and we would walk them home again. So finally, if anyone wants to see more of these, we can pass them around. You can come and get them. Finally, the schoolmasters were like, okay, we know you do this every day. Thank you for that. But why don't you come and say hello to our kids and teach them about who you are? It's like, okay. So this was a classroom of 6th graders. Little boys and girls, all in their little uniforms, because everybody there wears uniforms, and we're talking to them about what we do, that we're called to be a shield, really, a shield of peace in their lives, to help them get to school without being injured or arrested or shot in some way. And I told them, and I'll remember this, I said, you know who is the greatest teacher of peace to me? And these are Muslim kids, because Hebron's a Muslim city. I said, of course, Jesus. I'm a Christian. They know that. I said, of course, Jesus is a great teacher, but in my daily life, it's you. It's 6th graders. And they're all looking at me like I'm kind of like a little crazy. Of course, it's being translated, so I hope they said what I said, because you never really know. But anyway, so I'm talking to them, and I'm like, you guys are the best teachers of nonviolence and of peacemaking and of courage, because you go to school every single day, and you do it in a war zone. You have to go through military checkpoints. Not only do you get your bags checked and your body searched, every time you choose to go to school, particularly as a young boy, you can be arrested and put in jail and not be seen by your family or ever have a lawyer visit. You can be imprisoned. You can be shot. You can be beaten. And you can be left for dead. And this is the experience of children in Hebron. You can go to school, and then you can be gassed by tear gas. You can be sprayed by what they call sewer water, basically. But they went to school every day. And I have to tell you, some of these kids had to climb out on the roof of their houses. You saw the picture of the kids on the roof? They have to get out of the roof of their houses. They'd have to crawl from this roof. Then there'd be a plank. They'd crawl across the plank, walk. I would crawl. They would walk across the plank to the next roof. And then right outside of the old city of Hebron, there's this big metal door. And they would come out of that door, jump on the roof of what I would suppose is like a cobbler shop. It was a metal building, a little metal room. They would climb down from there, down a ladder to the Shahada Street, which is a street that Palestinians are not allowed to walk on in Hebron. It's only for Israelis, even though their door is open to that street. So they can't go out their front door. They have to climb all around the city to get out. And then we would meet them there and walk them to school. Can you imagine having to do all that to get to school? But that's what these kids do pretty much every day. That's the reality of these children when they go to school. And these are young Muslim children who know of Jesus. They know Jesus as a prophet. They know of Mary. They don't worship Jesus as the Son of God like we do, but they know who Jesus is. And it's those little Muslim kids that taught me what courage is all about, that taught me what a better, faithful Christian I could be if I just had similar courage to walk the path that we're called to this Christmas in this letter by Reverend John, the path of creative nonviolence, the path of peace, of radical love, the path of children around the world who say no to war and yes to education for a transformed future. And it turns out that right now, in our own warfare, 90% of casualties in war are now civilians. They say that World War II, people in World War I wouldn't even recognize war the way it is today because 90% of the casualties are civilians like you and I, like those children, like Luis Colon, who was killed here just a few days ago. And 50% of that number are children. So my call today to us is, when we think of who is Jesus, the good news, Jesus is the good news because he is the Prince of Peace. He is a teacher of nonviolence. He is a teacher of creative love, of radical love. And we have, as Christians, in this new year, let us join together and find creative ways to put the end to war, to put the end to arms being sold in our streets or sold to countries that are perpetrating violence against their own people or their neighbors. Let us find ways to step out of our places of comfort here in Bridgeport and work for transforming systems of injustice, whether it's economic injustice that pushes people into poverty, whether it's social injustice, cultural injustice such as racism or classism or sexism. What can we do to bring this Christmas message to our neighbors every day in the new year? I invite you to go home this day and talk with your family. What are the stories of people in your family that have done such courageous things? What have you done? I imagine all of you have stories of ways you've reached out and changed someone's life. This year, I invite you to be creative, to take steps of nonviolence, to go out into the streets and say, no more war. We want a better world for our children. We want our streets safe for our youth. We want our homes to be free of violence and terror. We want a world where the Prince of Peace can flourish in our hearts. Amen.